but this is good. So let's begin now. So the question for tonight is, which church did Christ found? And there's a lot of churches out there, so this is a very important question. And it's a matter of a historical fact that Jesus did, in fact, found a church. There's a lot of writings outside of the Bible which talks about early Christianity and the outline of a church back then. But you also have evidence inside the New Testament that talks about an early church. And what you see here is that Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail." So in this quotation you see that Jesus is founding a church, and he says the gates of the netherworld will not prevail. So the church will stand throughout the ages. So Peter Kraft, in his talk on 7 reasons to be Catholic, outlines 7 reasons to be Catholic. And what he says, first reason is Walker Percy, who says, what else is there? It's kind of a funny question, but he outlines 8 choices that we all have to make. First, are we honest or dishonest? And do we believe in truth? And the example that Peter Kraft uses is the Santa Claus example. So Santa doesn't exist. Sorry, David. Santa doesn't exist. But that's the truth. And even though Santa makes you happy when you're little, and Santa makes you do good things because you want to impress Santa so you get good gifts, you know that it's true, and so the truth trumps the happiness and trumps your good behavior. If people believe today that Santa existed, maybe the people would be good, but that's not the case. People will follow truth. So those are the first 2. But then we get to the third, does God exist? And from there we can know from reason, as we've seen in earlier apologetics courses, that God does exist just based on human reason. Questions 4 and 5, is there one God or is there many gods? And then God, is he everything, like that piano over there? Is that God, or is he transcendent from everything else? That God transcends the universe and he created the universe, everything out of nothing. So that's another question. And 4 and 5 talk about the nature of God. That's in the book. It's chapter 4, I believe, and you can read more about that. We didn't really cover that too much, but based on human reason, we can understand the answers to those questions. And then question 6, has God revealed himself to humans? A lot of religions are man's search for God. But in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, it's God's search for man. So it's God coming down and lifting people up to his level. It's him revealing himself to the people. It's not people just searching for God. And then question 7 is what makes a difference between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism is Jesus' claim to divinity. Jesus is God. Christians say Jesus is God. So that's big separation. So as you see, we're getting narrower and narrower. And we get to this last question, which is Jesus' church? And as you've seen through the Apologetics course, we've been kind of doing that. We've started kind of broad with faith and reason. We started with the question, does God exist? We've trickled down through the divinity of Christ, and now we're at which church did Jesus found? So we're going to talk about that more tonight with mostly the reasons that Peter Kraft outlined in his talk. But his second reason was Newman, Cardinal John Henry Newman. And of course, this is the same Newman that our Newman Center is named after. What a coincidence, huh? So, John Henry Newman, he was a cardinal, and he took the historical route. So what he said was, if you could take a time machine and look at the early church, what would that look like? Would it be Catholic, or would it be some denomination of Protestant, or would it be a non-denominational evangelical church like we have today? So he did his research, he looked at the church fathers, the early Christian writers, and he noticed that they were extraordinarily Catholic. What he was trying to do was he was trying to prove that it was more of a Church of England type church, but because he was Anglican at that time. And when he went back, he discovered that it was Catholic. The early Christians believed in the real presence. They believe in honoring Mary and many other things that we have today in the Catholic Church. So he converted to Catholicism and eventually became a cardinal. And other religions would say, okay, well, the New Testament, that's corrupt. So, like the New Age movement, some of the New Age movement parts would say that New Testament is corrupt. Or Islam says that the New Testament is corrupt, it shouldn't be read. So the dating of the Gospels and the historical accuracy of the Gospels are absolutely crucial to this question. And what we see is with the early Christian writers and the early church fathers, what they viewed of Christianity matches what the New Testament has. And so there's good evidence to believe that the New Testament is authentic. So C.S. Lewis is the third argument that Peter Kraft says is why he believes in the Catholic Church. And that goes to the aut Deus aut homo malus argument, which we talked about before when we were talking about the divinity of Christ. And what that says is either God or a bad man, because Jesus claims to be God. Jesus says he's God, so it automatically rules out the possibility that he's just a good man, because a mere man who claims to be God is not a good man. He either is who he says he is, or he's a bad man. So the church is the same way. We can look at the church in the same way, in which the church, it says that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. It says the priest can forgive sins. The priest can turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And so if the church is wrong about that, then it is idolatrous, it is blasphemous, it is wicked. It is not a good church. There's no real middle ground there. So Peter Kraft uses that as one of the arguments in favor of the Catholic Church. And then the next one is the Nicene Creed. So the Nicene Creed was written in the 4th century, and it was combating heresies at that time. And what they did was the bishops put together the Nicene Creed that we say at Mass. I believe in one God, etc. And they got a whole group of bishops together. It was the first ecumenical council, and they approved the words of the Nicene Creed. But what we see in the Nicene Creed is there's 4 marks of the church, and they outline what the true church is, no matter where you are at any time, to distinguish between heresies and other churches that might pop up. And those 4 marks are 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. 1, because just one church, and it all goes back to the deposit of faith from the apostles. Holy, not necessarily perfect, but set aside for God. God set aside the church. And we can see that in many things, that the church seems to be the enemy sometimes of the secular media. Then there's the Catholic mark. That doesn't necessarily mean Catholic Church, but it means universal. The word Catholic actually comes from the word universal. And so apostolic, which is the 4th mark, and that's the most obvious mark there. And we can see it when it's a historical fact that Christ appointed apostles. But then these apostles, they appointed successors, and then the successors, and they're called bishops, and the successors eventually appointed, the successors are still around today, the bishops are still around today in the Catholic Church. And you can trace the line from the bishops that we have today all the way back to the apostles. And the most obvious is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who there's a lot of well-documented sources that the Pope is descended from Peter in that apostolic line. You can go to any textbook or any book on the Pope, and some Catholic Bibles have the list of popes as well, and Wikipedia I'm sure has it too. But you can look at that, it's just a very well documented thing. And some people might say, okay, well, what's this deal with Peter? Well, Peter was the leader of the early apostles, and what we saw earlier in this quotation, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Jesus is building his rock on Peter because Peter's name means rock. In Greek you had Petros, which means rock. Now some people might try to dispute that. Some non-Catholics would try to dispute that by saying, okay, well, if you actually look at the Greek, he says Petros, meaning Peter, but for the word rock, he says Petra. he doesn't actually say Petros. So it's a different rock. He's talking about Peter's faith, confession of faith here. But if you look at the actual context, you'll notice that this is the part where Jesus asked the disciples, okay, so who do people say that I am? And the disciples respond, well, some people say you're Elijah, some one of the prophets that have arisen from the dead, others John the Baptist. But then Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, Son of the living God. So right there you see Peter says, you are the Christos, which you would have in Greek. You're the Christos. And then he explains it. Well, here you have Jesus echoing that, saying, you are the Petros. And then he explains what that means. Upon this rock I will build my church. So if you look at the context, you see that that explanation is in favor of what the Catholic Church would say, that the rock that he's referring to is Peter. So if you were to directly translate this, it would be, you are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. It's more clear if you do that. Obviously, Peter is a name that we have today that we use, so it doesn't change directly like that. But that's an explanation of Peter's role in the church. And you can see that in Acts as well. In the beginning stages of the Acts of the Apostle, you see that Peter is the one to step up, and he's the leader of the early church. And so there's also a couple other reasons that Peter Kreeft has, and it's truth, goodness, and beauty. In truth, in which the doctrines of Catholicism stand up even against, you can look at any doctrine and none of them will fall, none of them have inherent contradictions in them. Goodness, the Catholic Church is one of the greatest institutions in history in reaching out to others and improving the lives of others. And beauty, just the genius in Catholicism converts many, many people. So there we have the 7 reasons outlined by Peter Kreeft in his 7 reasons to be Catholic. And we could go into a lot more of this stuff, as this was just a brief survey, but if we were to go into all that stuff, we'd probably be here all night.